Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Edwin Shuker. I'm Vice President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. I'm also the Chair of the Communities and Education Division. The Board of Deputies is the democratic voice of the British Jewish community. I want to welcome each and every one of you who are joining us this afternoon. This is our contribution to Refugee Week. And I think we have a most interesting session coming up. In 1971, I myself arrived here as a refugee and was granted asylum. Back home, we had to live through a hellish 8 years until we managed to escape and arrive here. Back home, I only had one challenge: how to get out with our lives. And arriving here, there was first a sense of huge gratitude, but many challenges comes up. Clothes, I was not prepared for this winter. Money, it was tens of times the amount for each item that we were spending back home. Friends, language, a multitude of challenges. But above all, we were traumatized. No one risks his life to come without being suffering enough to be traumatized. What I wanted was for someone to hear me, to hear my story, what I suffered, how I escaped, how grateful I am. And also that I wasn't a beggar back home. But now I need many things. And I feel what I need most is my dignity back. These feelings I conveyed to hundreds of students in our schools. I always made sure that any invitation that comes from a school on Refugee Week, I cherish that activity. I was 16 when I arrived, so therefore I was their age. And when I speak to them, I immediately know that suddenly all their thinking of what is a refugee and what is an asylum seeker has changed instantly. They see a human person who needs an end rather than someone who is a leech. One thing I want to mention of one of the stories I tell in these schools, especially when I go to Humanising, relates to family Schoenfeld, of which Amos is our star today, who organized this thing, head chair of the social action group, or co-chair. When we arrived, my sisters needed to go to a school, to a Jewish school, but we didn't fit the criteria. The language was not strong enough. The practice was not exactly orthodox as Hasmonin school demanded. And my father had only one chance to overrule this objection. He went to Amos' grandfather, Zichronon Bracha, Mr. Schoenfeld, who ran the school, who founded the school. And he told him in words what a refugee is and why he needs to help us. Mr. Schoenfeld accepted and agreed to overrule the rejection. Later on, my sister went to become the head girl of the Hasmonean school, and her daughter was the head girl, and she married the head boy of the Jewish boys' school. This is the story of refugees, and I wish you a very pleasant talk. I want to introduce now the two people who will entertain us and inform us today. I'm proud to introduce Enver Solomon, who is the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, since December 2020. Following nearly 3 years as CEO of Just for Kids, a charity providing youth support and legal representation to children and young people facing adversity. Enver served for 5 years as a chair of trustees as the charity Asylum Aid and was founding trustee of the charity British Future. Enver is proud to be the first CEO in the organization's 70-year history, who is from a Black and minority ethnic Black background. Talking to him is Michael Wegier. Michael has been the chief executive of the Board of Deputies of British Jews since 2021. Michael has worked as a Jewish educator, strategic planner, and chief executive for Jewish organizations in the UK, Israel, and the US. Michael has a degree in Jewish history from UCL and an MA in contemporary Jewry from the Hebrew University. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Hi, thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Em, for being with us. I'll also add my thanks to Amos, the co-chair of the committee, because really I am here because of Amos, his grandfather, in that my father was one of the Schonfeld boys who was brought to England as a refugee in 1946. And so my family owes an enormous debt to the Schonfeld family and what Dr. Solomon Schonfeld did for thousands of Jewish children in the UK. And I'd like to start with a little bit about yourself. And I think people should know a little bit about you, apart from the very, very impressive resume that Edwin just read out. But when I first came across your name, I said to myself, Solomon, that's a bit biblical. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what I suspect is some Jewish heritage somewhere in your background.
That's right, really, Michael. The surname gives it away, doesn't it? My father, British Jew, born and brought up in Liverpool, in and around Liverpool and the Wirral. My forefathers on his side of the family came here as refugees, fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Europe and in Russia at the turn of the previous centuries. And they settled in the Wirral, in the local rag trade, as it was called. And my father grew up there, experiencing quite a lot of anti-Semitic abuse, I should say, when he went to Wallasey Grammar School. And then the Enver in my name is a Muslim name. My mother came here fleeing apartheid South Africa, having grown up in a traditional Muslim Indian community in South Africa under apartheid, and having worked with Winnie Mandela as a social worker in Soweto, taking her to see Nelson when he was on the move, living in secure accommodation, in hiding, in effect.
So thank you. I mean, so that's an extremely important part of who you are, that story coming from both your father and your mother. And thank you for sharing that with us. People will see they can throw some comments into the chat. And as you do so, as I'm talking to Enver, I will certainly ask some of those questions along the way. So please do feel free. I apologize if I don't get to everybody's, but I want to give a chance. And thank you. The first person just put one up, and I appreciate it. And I invite many more. Let's sort of start with the topic of our conversation. Why don't you just shed a little bit of statistical information for us? Don't blind us with too much science, but why don't you just give people a little bit of sense of the numbers, the current numbers of refugees seeking asylum, and where is the trend going? Where's it come from and where's it going over the last few years?
Yeah, so last year in 2022, there were 75,000 applications for asylum in the UK, which is the equivalent of just under 90,000 individual people. And they came from a range of nationalities, but it's actually the top nationalities that are really interesting and worth dwelling on. Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, countries that we know are affected by conflict, that are affected by strife, where people are persecuted. And there are also, in those top countries, Albanians, a large number of Albanians. Now, people might think, why Albania? There is a lot of exploitation, human trafficking, a lot of blood feuds and violence actually in Albania. We're not naive at the Refugee Council. We recognise that some Albanians will also come through the asylum route when perhaps they might be economic migrants. But the reality, and this is the key statistic here, Michael, is that of those applications, 3/4, just over 75%, were found when assessed by Home Office decision makers to be refugees, and they were allowed to stay in this country as refugees, which really challenges sometimes the rhetoric that people might hear in the media or elsewhere that suggests that all the people that are coming here seeking asylum are actually playing the system. They're not so-called genuine refugees and they're all economic migrants. The data doesn't bear that out. It's simply not the case.
Do you think there is some muddling in people's minds about the difference between these terms, refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants? How do you, in your office, how do you help people make sense of those terms and where we should be really most focusing our attention?
There's an awful lot of muddling, and actually when you poll the public and ask the public, they're often confused. They don't understand who people are, where they're coming from, why they're coming. They conflate economic migrant with someone who's seeking asylum, with someone who's a refugee. And actually, it's really important for us at the Refugee Council to try and ensure that people do understand who we're talking about, who we're working with at the Refugee Council. Well over 12,000 people we supported last year that came to the UK either seeking asylum or through so-called safe routes like the program for Ukrainians. There's also a program for Afghans as well. It's really important for us to help people understand and to challenge some of the misunderstandings that exist and to really ensure that people can make sense of it. So when people see the images of people coming on boats across the channel, the very visceral images, which I understand to some people are anxiety provoking, to ensure that people understand who they are, that they're coming from countries like Afghanistan, like Syria, like Sudan. We know what's happening in Sudan at the moment, that they are men, women and children that have had to take very dangerous journeys through no fault of their own, and that when they get here, the vast majority will be allowed to stay as refugees. So really emphasizing the humanity, the stories of people, the story like we heard right at the beginning from Edwin, his story. There's so many of those stories, and then the contribution that people make to this country as refugees.
So we've done a little bit about statistics and we've done something about terminology. I want to now go to the very other end of this experience, and maybe you could humanize just one or two stories for us. People who you've heard about through your office or you've come across, whose story you would like to share with our participants today and give them a sense of a much more human side of the refugee experience.
Well, I'd like to start with two boys from Afghanistan that I met down in Dover, where we look after children who arrive alone, having made very dangerous journeys. I met them a few months back, sitting down and talking to them. They spoke some broken English. It was clear, just looking in their eyes, how traumatized they were, how disorientated, how anxious, and just overwhelmed they were. They'd been sent by their parents alone as brothers to make a dangerous journey to this country because their parents' lives were at risk, having worked as politicians, having been politicians before the Taliban took control of Afghanistan. And just being with those two young boys and hearing their stories and hearing what they've been through, they came to the UK because they know there's a large Afghan community in the UK. They know that the UK has a history of welcoming Afghans, has a long history of being engaged in Afghanistan and standing up for the values of freedom, of democracy, of human rights that their parents held so dearly. And just being with those boys spoke volumes about what they'd been through, about how traumatized, and just how themselves were victims of circumstances that when they came into this world as babies had no idea, and just how their parents had done what any parent would want to do for their children, which is ensure that they were safe and it had to take that heart-wrenching decision to send them to make a very dangerous journey. I think the second story I'd like to share with you is the story of a Syrian woman who'd come here with her family to the UK, a very different story, if you like, from the two Afghan teenagers who had to come here by themselves, taking a very dangerous journey, who'd come with her children and her husband through the programme for Syrians that was set up by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, that brought 20,000 Syrians to the UK safely. We'd worked with them. They'd settled in North Yorkshire. They'd got a house through the local council. But for them, the fact that they'd been able to come here safely didn't mean that their trauma wasn't with them, didn't mean that they found settling in the UK incredibly difficult and incredibly challenging, having to learn English, but their desire to contribute and want to make a difference to this country was remarkable. And that gratitude, that sense that they really felt that they owed this country something from having enabled them to have a safe route to the UK was so powerful. I think that tells a story of how refugees so desperately want to show thanks and show gratitude to the UK and then go on and contribute. They don't want to be a drain on our resources. They don't want to live off benefits. For many, it's deeply embarrassing if they have to take a handout from the state. They want to stand on their own 2 feet and contribute, and many go on to see themselves as proud Britons when they do that.
You mentioned before Mr. Cameron, and you and I and several others from within the Jewish community worked with Michael Gove and Richard Harrington last year with the Ukrainian, when there was as the Ukrainian crisis broke out. What was your experience of working with government on that particular issue? And I want to move to some of the other countries that you've addressed.
Yeah, so I think what the government decided to do on Ukraine in terms of creating a scheme, quite a scheme at the time that, including myself and my own organisation, thought was quite high risk, whereby the British public would be encouraged to throw open their doors to host Ukrainians, was quite risky and quite politically well, I think it was Michael Gove was essentially doing something politically, in which he was putting his head on the block. He was trying something that had never been tried before. And it was on that level quite remarkable. It's remarkable that we've had tens of thousands of Ukrainians come to the UK being hosted right across this country, that hundreds of thousands of Britons put themselves forward to host Ukrainians. And I think that tells a story of how Britons do want to welcome refugees, do want to show compassion, and do want to stretch out a hand of welcome. And I think it shows, how when government wants to do something that it thinks is the right thing to do, we can do it. And we absorbed refugees on a scale in such a short period of time, in a matter of months, that has never been happened before. And the country is okay. Communities are okay. Ukrainians have gone on to contribute to live in communities. Some have had challenges, of course, getting jobs and with housing, but the vast majority have been able to be safe here and have been able to contribute to the UK. So I think that is a remarkable story in and of itself.
Thank you. I also share your view that Michael Gove and Lord Harrington took this really seriously, and no one would claim, I don't think they would claim they had 100% success, but it did look like a really serious effort to create joined up thinking between government, civil society, faith communities. I can see there's a comment in the chat about the work that from Amanda Bauman that the Jewish community did, and that's really, really important. There is a question, I want to bring one question from our audience. It's a very important one from Quink Quink Potter, and you can see it coming up on the big screen now. But the relationship between the responsibilities of the different statutory agencies. Could you maybe just shed a bit of light on that? I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, and it is a really important question because it tells a story of the tension between central and local governments here, and also how governments of different colours over many years have created what has become to be termed as a hostile environment for people that come here seeking asylum. So the government has a duty when someone comes here and is in the asylum system. If they're unable to stand on their own 2 feet, they've got nowhere to stay, to house them. The housing provision provided is pretty basic. Sometimes people don't even have a mobile phone because it's taken away from them. So that package, if you like, of support that central government puts in place is pretty basic. People are given £6 a day to live on. We know many people are living in hotels as well because of the large numbers in the asylum system waiting for a decision on their claim, 160,000, which talks of a system where there has been a large degree of mismanagement. The fact that 160,000 are waiting for a decision, well over half of those waiting up to 18 months and longer for a decision on their asylum claim. The government has a duty to those people, but then when people are dispersed across the country and allowed to stay as refugees, local authorities have a duty to ensure that they have their needs met, that they're not left homeless. And there is funding for different groups, so for Ukrainians, for Afghans, for the Syrians I spoke about, to be housed and to be integrated into local communities. But then there's a huge gap here because people that come through the asylum system, and remember 3/4 of those that come through the asylum system will be allowed to stay in the UK. When they're given a decision and they're said, yes, they're told by the Home Office, you can stay here, there is a gap whereby provision doesn't come in. So they can't apply for universal credit for benefits straight away. They have to find their own housing in the private rental market. There isn't an immediate safety net to support them. They have to stand on their own 2 feet very quickly. And it's during that period that people can face homelessness and can face destitution because there isn't an integrated package of support to integrate and support all refugees into communities, because we don't have a national refugee integration strategy, which we really need, so that all agencies are very clear on their roles and responsibilities.
So there are two pretty big issues that the government is looking at dealing with, and I wondered if you could just comment on each of them. One is the illegal migration bill. What will it change? And should it go through? And what are your thoughts on that? And secondly, could you talk a little bit about this plan that keeps emerging every few months about an agreement with Rwanda to send people there? I just wondered if you could just comment on both of those things briefly.
Yeah, these two are incredibly significant, and people will have read and heard about them in the news. They get an awful lot of media and political attention. And we really shouldn't underestimate how significant they are. The new bill that is going through Parliament, the illegal migration bill, as it's called, is a significant watershed moment. The UNHCR, which is the main UN agency responsible for refugees right across the globe, has described it as essentially extinguishing the right to seek asylum in the UK. That's not my judgment. That is the judgment and assessment of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. Because what the bill does is that it essentially says that if you have to take a journey under your own steam, a dangerous journey, often at the hand of people smugglers, controlled by people smugglers, to get to the UK, in the way that many people have had to do for generations, for decades, then when you get here, we will slam our door in your face. We will not allow you to apply for asylum. We will essentially say you are an illegal alien, to use language of the past. And what we will do is we will put you in detention, and we will either try and send you back to where you came from, and then this is where Rwanda comes in, or we'll try and send you to a third country, a so-called third country that the UK has an agreement with. The only third country that the UK does have an agreement with at the moment is Rwanda. So what the government is wanting to do is, if it can't return people to where they've come from because we don't have returns agreements in place with most countries, we will then try and send people to Rwanda. But the Rwanda deal is mired in legal wrangling in the courts about whether it is in essence legally sound, or whether it's in contravention of the UN Convention on Refugees. But if the government is able to send people to Rwanda, it's only going to be able to send a few hundred initially, by no means thousands or not even tens of thousands. And there's a whole number of questions that have been raised by the UN about what will happen to them in Rwanda. Rwanda doesn't really have a very good functioning asylum system. It doesn't apply international treaties to how it operates its asylum system. And the experience of a deal that Rwanda previously had with Israel, when it agreed to take some people who were in the asylum system in Israel, in Rwanda, was that when those people got to Rwanda, they simply fled Rwanda because they didn't have a good experience, and then they had to try and take dangerous journeys again to re-enter Europe. So the jury is really out on whether the Rwanda deal is going to make any difference and whether people will be able to be sent to Rwanda. But the reality of what the government is doing, and I can't stress this enough, it is that it is turning its back on the UN Convention on Refugees, and it is saying that as a nation, we will no longer allow people to come here seeking asylum if they've had to do it through no fault of their own by any means that they've been able to take to get to the UK.
So many of us will have read in the papers over the last few days that net migration to the UK is significantly higher than the government said it wanted it to be. And I'm very aware of what you said at the beginning of our conversation about the muddle between refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. And I absolutely take your point there. I'm sure we all do. But do you have any sympathy for the government's position here that many, many communities in the UK are unrecognisable from how they were 20 years ago? And it's really since the Blair era and then carried on by Cameron, etc. And that the face of British society is just changing so quickly that it might be too much. And I wonder how much of your work is actually affected by that general trend of how people are seeing the UK going.
So I completely understand that UK society and UK communities have changed dramatically. And it's not just in the last 20 years, it's over a number of decades. I mean, it was in the 1970s that there was a huge influx of Asians from Uganda as a result of Idi Amin's brutality in Uganda. We had Vietnamese coming here as a consequence of what happened in Vietnam many decades ago, the so-called Vietnamese boat people. We had many people coming from the former Yugoslavia due to the horrendous violence and war that took place in the former Yugoslavia following the collapse of the communist regimes. And then we've had, immigration from many parts of former colonial countries that Britain controlled previously, from Africa, from the West Indies. The UK has evolved, as has many European countries. For us at the Refugee Council, we see that as a positive. We know that people that come here as refugees and also that come here as migrants go on to make incredible contributions to British communities. Just look at, for example, Mo Farah, who wrapped himself in the Union Jack after winning Olympic golds when London hosted the Olympics. Remarkable reflection and embodiment of a modern Britain, if you like. And I think a modern Britain reflects the fact that, like America, it's a reflection of a changing nation that has been changed due to welcoming people and due to people coming here as immigrants. That's not to say that the Refugee Council advocates open borders. We believe in both controlling our borders, but demonstrating compassion and running an asylum system, also an immigration system, which is competent. And competence means that you don't leave people languishing for months and years on end, awaiting a decision. You don't run a system that results in people that came here decades ago and that are here legitimately, having worked in the NHS and other parts of British society, having come here as a Windrush generation, then receive letters decades later telling them that they're going to be deported. That is not a competent asylum and immigration system. It's not a system that shows compassion. And of course, we need to have control. And our point about control is ensure that you make good quality decisions when people come here seeking asylum, timely decisions, good quality decisions. And if someone is not found to have a well-founded fear of persecution as defined by the UN Convention, that, by the way, we were one of the founding signatories of and played a critical role in bringing that convention into being. If people don't have that well-founded fear of persecution, of course, we should take steps to enable them to return to where they've come from. But we should do that seriously and competently and in a way that demonstrates humanity and dignity. We're not even doing that at the moment because the government doesn't have a proper returns program in place. So we would articulate control, compassion, and competence. And if those are delivered well, you can have a system that allows for Britain to bring people here as refugees and also as immigrants through a functioning immigration system that I don't think puts the nation under threat. And a final thought, the Office of Budget Responsibility, in its own independent economic assessment, concluded that immigration was a positive to Britain's economic development. And for that reason, managed immigration, controlled immigration was an absolute positive that this country should embrace.
Thank you. I'd like to put up on the screen Amanda Bauman's question, particularly the second part of it. What do you think is the best way for the people watching this today? What can they do? How can we do our bit? What would be your... So I've understood a bit about your asks of government, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I think Amanda's question is really important. What can we do?
It's a really important question because actually faith groups, civic society have a huge role to play in supporting people that come here as refugees. The welcoming that so many refugees talk about when you talk to them that they've received from local communities across this country is really powerful for them and means an awful lot. And that is often the role of faith groups. So whether that is faith groups realizing that there are people who have come here seeking asylum in their communities, they might be staying in hotels, which the government is having to use because of the huge backlog in asylum decision-making, ensuring that faith groups are able to engage, meet the needs of those, working with charities, other charities that are supporting people in the asylum system or that have come here as refugees, whether that's from Ukraine or Afghanistan. Lots of faith groups can link up with those charities, volunteering, helping people. If you have skills to help people to learn English or other skills around befriending, mentoring, there's a whole range of ways that I think faith groups can get involved with the myriad of local organizations that are connected to support people in the asylum system and to support refugees.
I know you touched upon this a little bit before, but I'd like you to maybe go back over it or hone it slightly. But it's very easy for those of us who are in the third sector to throw criticism or comments at government. I mean, it's part of our job, more your job than our job, I would say, but certainly that is your job. And I wondered if there were 3 principal asks you had of government to help improve situation, very, very practical level. What would they be?
Yeah, and they really link back to my 3 C's of competence, compassion, and control. I think my first thing would be to ensure that there is timely decision-making for people when they come here seeking asylum, that they're not left for months, years on end, awaiting a decision. And that means you have a system that works well. You have a system that is properly resourced, that is properly equipped. It's astonishing that it's only recently that Home Office decision makers has moved from stopping to use spreadsheets, can you believe it or not, to move to using a more functioning IT system which allows for effective and efficient decision making. So that is absolutely key. The second ask is to treat people as you would be expected to be treated yourself if you had to flee for your life. And that means treat people with dignity and compassion. So that means that if they arrive here and they have They don't have the essentials that they need, clothing. They don't have a mobile phone. You allow them to access the support and the essential provisions that they need. And critically, you ensure that they're able to access legal advice and good information so they know what is happening to them, so their voice can be heard. So that is fundamentally about some very simple things. You don't put them in poor quality accommodation in the middle of nowhere and they don't have any information about they know what's going on. At the moment, if you're in the asylum system, there's one helpline you can call, and on average, people will be left waiting an hour to find out what's happening to their case. That is not treating people with dignity and compassion. So that is my second point. And I think my third point, which is absolutely critical, which is about how we talk about people that come here, that we recognize that people that come here are not individuals that should be maligned through no fault of their own, but we recognize them as our fellow human beings. So then we don't use the language of invasion. We don't assume that they're all guilty until proven innocent and describe them all as illegal, or give them the blanket label illegal, or dare I say it, as languages have been used more recently, as say that the majority of them or a large number of them are coming here as criminals. We recognize them for who they are, as individual men, women and children from countries that are war-torn and where there is persecution, and we allow them a fair hearing on arrival. So we recognize that they are individual human beings, men, women and children like us. We allow them a fair hearing and we don't tarnish them with a single brush as being invaders or criminals and assume that they're all guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah, I don't think I can do better than David Sello has just commented on the screen here, but those were excellent 3 points. I think we've more or less come to the end of our time, and I'm going to hand back to Amos in a second. But I wanted to give you a chance if there was something more that you wanted to say to the British Jewish community from your post at the Refugee Council. There's something else that I've not asked you that you'd like to have been asked that you'd like to share as a parting thought.
Well, I think my final thought is our country is made up of collective individuals, and faith groups are a critical part of our communities and who we are as a country. And I think it's through faith groups having conversations with other people that people can understand what it means to be a refugee, the experience of being a refugee that we heard very powerfully from Edwin at the start. So I think I would say to people, you have a role to play in raising public awareness, in talking about the experience of refugees, which is so integral to the Jewish experience in the UK. So really not to forget that and think about how you, in your own individual way, could do that.
Enver, thank you very much. And I'm now very happy to invite Amos Schonfield for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Enver. So my name is Amos Schonfield. I am the co-chair of the Social Justice Committee of the Board of Deputies. And after that fascinating discussion and conversation, I'm delighted to be able to thank you both and to thank Edwin Shuker for his words at the beginning, and not just because both Edwin and Michael had nice things to say about my family and my family's story. We heard a fascinating conversation that built on that sort of historical continuity between the stories that we know of our community, both in terms of being refugees and of welcoming and hosting refugees, and heard from Enver about the values of compassion, of welcome, competence, humanity, dignity, control and sensibility that we aspire to have in our asylum system today. I'm really grateful that the Board of Deputies has taken a role in leading, magnifying the community's perspectives when it comes to having an asylum system rooted in those values. And as someone who, aside from my role volunteering at the board, leads 2 small refugee charities, I'm really grateful to Enver and the work of the Refugee Council to play that leading role within the sector. I just want to flag that we're doing this as part of Refugee Week, where we're I think at the earliest part of what Refugee Week can be, which will be taking place starting from I think the 19th of June, which is the Monday, as part of the week of celebration across the whole community, well, across the whole UK, let alone our community, including World Refugee Day on the 20th of June. So you can visit the Refugee Week website to learn about what is going on. If you are interested in taking what you've heard here today forward, there are refugee and asylum seeker drop-in centres in synagogues all across the UK of either great or small size. And if you don't have one and want to learn more, there will be a session to learn more that the board will be advertising and supporting towards the end of June. And you can also look at the work of Highest J-Corps, which I can shout about because I work there, which is formerly the Jewish Council of Racial Equality, and is a key part of the response to the asylum system from within the Jewish community. I'm really grateful and glad that we've had this conversation, that we can take the positivity and the thought that we've had today forward into the rest of our days. Thank you very much also to Harriet and to Sarah and to Leo for bringing this together. And I hope everyone has a lovely day.